For more on this, let's bring in Eric Ham, U.S. political analyst. Eric, good to see you. We are seeing some supporters and some protesters there in front of the courthouse on the wide shot. What are you seeing? What are you hearing on the ground?
Well, you can tell Trump is in the vicinity. There are far more people out here than there were earlier. It's getting far more raucous. It's getting far more hectic. You've got the supporters, you've got the detractors, and they are making their presence felt regardless of where they stand. We're seeing flags flying. We're seeing a much greater security presence all around us. And it's becoming more intense as we now see that Donald Trump is actually going to be arraigned in less than an hour.
Let's talk about the fact that we are in this position once again. For the third time, we are seeing Donald Trump being arraigned. Let's talk about how this time is different.
You know, I've been hearing that all day, that these charges are more serious. This makes Donald Trump far more vulnerable. Actually, I think the classified documents case certainly is just as serious. In any case where someone has absconded with classified national security documents, that person has always been given jail time. And Donald Trump is certainly going to be facing that as well. In addition, what we see taking place here with these 4 charges that are being brought against Donald Trump today, they are just as serious as the charges in the classified documents case. But what we see is a compelling narrative. Looks like now Donald Trump is actually here. You're seeing people run towards him. What you're seeing now is Donald Trump, in this particular case, is now being held to account for something that took place 2 years ago, where the country has been rallying for more accountability for what took place at the U.S. Capitol.
Yeah, we're just showing our viewers some video of Donald Trump earlier today leaving his golf course in Bedminster, New Jersey, and the small motorcade on the way to the airport where he took a flight to get to Washington earlier today. Let's talk a little bit more about what impact you think these charges might have on his aspirations. Of course, we know that he is a frontrunner right now for the GOP nomination for the 2024 presidential election.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, every time we see Donald Trump has been the specter of a criminal indictment or a criminal indictment has come down, we have seen Donald Trump's approval ratings, particularly with his base, go up. In addition to that, we have also seen that he has extended his lead over the GOP field and, of course, extend his lead in terms of raising money as well. I suspect this will be no different, because what we continue to see is Donald Trump is not only pacing the field, but it's becoming increasingly clear that Donald Trump, unless something dramatically changes, will be the nominee based on what the polling data is showing us today. In addition to that, we know that there's the possibility of more charges to come for Donald Trump from Georgia, where we know the Fulton County District Attorney is prepared to bring charges in that case in less than a month.
Right, and we are hearing from members of the GOP, including Trump's former vice president, Mike Pence. He was speaking out on social media. He spoke to a crowd in Indiana about the charges against Trump. He is saying that anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. When it comes to other people who are vying for that nomination, that GOP nomination, are their words falling on deaf ears at this point?
I believe so, because Donald Trump has been masterful at shaping the narrative about these indictments and about the criminality surrounding him as a weaponization by the government against him. And he's saying that he is the shield for his base of supporters, that he is taking the blow for what the federal government has done to them. And it's working. But again, what we see in terms of what Donald Trump is doing politically is very different in terms of what Donald Trump ultimately is going to have to face criminally and legally. Because as we have already seen, the charges that Donald Trump is facing, the evidence in these cases appears insurmountable and overwhelming. And right now, we don't see where Donald Trump, at least not yet, has actually put together a defense that would seem to be captivating to a jury that is going to have to hear either here in Washington or in Florida as well.
And talk to us also, Eric, about the type of jury he's going to be facing. And, you know, we know that he's not very popular in Washington, D.C.
That's an understatement. Donald Trump is not popular at all in Washington. Even more, we know that the judge that will be presiding over this case is an Obama-appointed judge, and we know that she has handed down very stiff sentences for January 6th defendants. In fact, going above and beyond what the prosecutors have asked for in those particular cases. So what we see here is Donald Trump already beginning the process of attempting to try to move this case out of Washington to West Virginia. And for our viewers, West Virginia is a state where Donald Trump got the highest percentage of support than any other state. It's unlikely that will happen, but clearly Donald Trump even recognizes that given his popularity here, he believes that he cannot get a fair trial. That remains to be seen, and it's unclear if a judge is actually going to agree with him on that sentiment.
Right, and on that note, we'll probably hear him repeating those sentiments, those thoughts to crowds, to his supporters. What about the optics of this all then, when it comes to whether or not this is going to be fuel for those who support Donald Trump to say that, you know, that the elite or that the Democrats are out to get him?
Yes, in fact, we're already hearing from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump's closest competitor. He made that argument in a statement when these charges came down that Washington, D.C. is the epicenter of political weaponization that's taking place, and that Donald Trump cannot get a fair trial because of Washingtonian jurors. And we're going to clearly hear Donald Trump say that. In fact, many believe one of the reasons why Jack Smith, the special counsel, actually moved the classified documents case from Washington to Florida was to negate that argument that somehow Donald Trump was not getting a fair assessment or a fair trial. But he will certainly, many believe he will get that in Florida because Florida is seen as Donald Trump country. But here, I think you're going to see a judge who is going to be fair, but may not necessarily be as lenient towards Donald Trump as what we have seen from the judge in Florida.
Eric, I wonder what you make of the indictment, of what you've seen in the indictment, what you make of this case specifically, and what we could be hearing further from the special counsel.
You know, it's interesting because in this 45-page indictment, what we saw was the special counsel actually concede this idea of Donald Trump's free speech, that he had a right to make these claims, however untrue they were, that he had a right to say them, even to go so far as to lie about what actually happened with the election. He concedes that point to Donald Trump. But where he is making his argument, where the special counsel is going to make his case, is that Donald Trump attempted to obstruct a federal congressional event. And that was the certification of the election, but not only at the congressional level, but also with an attempt to try to install fake electors in those 7 states that were named in the indictment. Some of those states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, are some of the states that were named in that indictment. And Donald Trump is going to say, this is about speech, speech, speech. What Jack Smith is going to say, this is not about your speech. This goes beyond your speech, and you crossed the line when you attempted to obstruct a congressional proceeding and when you attempted to install fake electors in those states where clearly Joe Biden had won.
Just finally here before we let you go for now, Eric, I did want to ask you your thoughts on, okay, what if Donald Trump is found not guilty in this case? And what if he goes on, this is jumping ahead, but I was wondering about this, what if he goes on to win in 2024? Is there an opportunity for him to pardon himself? What would that mean?
You know, that's a question that continues to come up. But what we have to remember, Donald Trump is still facing a bevy of charges in state court in Manhattan. And we do know that those charges that are likely to come down over the next few weeks in Fulton County, those are state charges as well. In those 2 instances, Donald Trump does not have the ability to pardon himself, which means if he is found guilty in both of those jurisdictions, or at least one of those jurisdictions, he will have to face accountability for those crimes.
Okay, we do have to leave it there for now. Eric Ham, U.S. political analyst, joining us from Washington, D.C. just